Sarah Martinez stood in the corner of the high school cafeteria, her lunch tray trembling slightly in her hands. The conversation at the nearby table had grown louder, and she could hear every cruel word being thrown around like daggers. It was the same group of popular kids who seemed to take pleasure in finding new ways to make others feel small. "Did you guys hear what Sarah said in history class yesterday?" Ashley Thompson's voice cut through the usual cafeteria noise like a knife. She actually tried to tell Mr. Peterson that her mom was some kind of war hero or something. The laughter that followed made Sarah's cheeks burn with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, and never have to face these people again. But she stayed frozen in place, unable to move as the conversation continued. "My dad says women weren't even allowed in combat roles back then," Marcus Williams added, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sarah's just making stuff up to try to sound important. Her mom probably just worked in some office or cafeteria on a military base." Sarah's grip tightened on her lunch tray. These kids had no idea what they were talking about. They didn't know her mother, didn't understand the sacrifices she had made, the dangers she had faced. But every time Sarah tried to defend her mother's service, they just laughed harder. The story had started innocently enough during Mr. Peterson's American history class. They were discussing military operations in Afghanistan, and the teacher had asked if anyone had family members who had served overseas. Sarah had raised her hand hesitantly, knowing that sharing anything personal in this school was risky. "My mother served 3 tours in Afghanistan," she had said quietly, her voice barely audible over the shuffling of papers and whispered conversations. The classroom had fallen silent for a moment, and Sarah thought maybe, just maybe, her classmates would show some respect. Instead, she heard the first snicker from the back row. What did she do? Cook meals for the real soldiers? Someone had whispered, thinking they were being quiet enough that the teacher wouldn't hear. Mr. Peterson had tried to maintain order, asking Sarah to share more about her mother's service, but the damage was already done. The snickers had turned into barely contained laughter, and Sarah had mumbled something about her mother being involved in reconnaissance missions before quickly looking down at her desk. Now, sitting alone in the cafeteria, Sarah replayed that moment over and over in her mind. She thought about her mother, Maria Martinez, who worked double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet. The same woman who still woke up in cold sweats sometimes, calling out names of people Sarah had never met. The woman who kept a small American flag folded in a triangle in a special place on her dresser, never talking about how she had earned it. "The thing is," Ashley continued, her voice getting even louder as more students gathered around to listen. "Sarah's mom works at Tony's Diner downtown. I've seen her there. She's just a waitress. There's no way she was ever in the military, let alone doing anything important. Maybe she watched too many action movies and got confused," another voice added, causing another wave of laughter. Sarah finally found the strength to move, quickly walking toward the exit doors of the cafeteria. She could hear the laughter following her, but she didn't look back. As she pushed through the heavy doors, she nearly collided with Mrs. Rodriguez, the school counselor. "Sarah, honey, are you all right?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, noting the tears that were threatening to spill from Sarah's eyes. "I'm fine," Sarah lied, trying to step around the older woman. But Mrs. Rodriguez gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I heard what happened in Mr. Peterson's class yesterday, and I can hear what's going on in there," she said, nodding toward the cafeteria. "Do you want to talk about it?" For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like someone might actually listen to her. She followed Mrs. Rodriguez to her office, where she poured out the whole story. She told her about how her mother never talked about her military service, how she only found out about it by accident, when she discovered some old photographs and medals hidden in the back of her mother's closet. "My mom gets really upset when I ask about it," Sarah explained, wiping her nose with a tissue. "She just says that part of her life is over, and she doesn't want to think about it anymore. But I know she did important things. I found pictures of her in uniform with other soldiers. She looked so brave and strong." Mrs. Rodriguez listened carefully, making notes and asking gentle questions. She had been working at the school for over 20 years, and had seen her share of students struggling with family issues. But something about Sarah's story struck her as particularly authentic. "Sarah," she said finally, "and I think it's wonderful that you're proud of your mother's service. Military families often carry burdens that others don't understand. But nobody else believes me," Sarah said, fresh tears starting to fall. "They all think I'm lying, that I'm just trying to make myself seem more interesting or important. Sometimes people don't believe things because they're outside of their own experience," Mrs. Rodriguez explained. "These kids probably don't know anyone who has served in the military. To them, it might seem like something that only happens in movies." The conversation continued for the rest of the lunch period, with Mrs. Rodriguez helping Sarah develop strategies for dealing with the bullying. But as the bell rang and Sarah prepared to return to class, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The next few weeks were torture. The story of Sarah's fictional mother spread throughout the school like wildfire. What had started as cruel laughter in the cafeteria evolved into full-scale mockery. Students would salute her sarcastically in the hallways, make fake radio calls when she walked by, and whisper, "Mission impossible," whenever she entered a classroom. The worst part was that Sarah began to doubt herself. Her mother's silence about her military service had always seemed like modesty, but now she wondered if there was something else going on. What if her classmates were right? What if she had misunderstood something, misinterpreted the photographs and medals she had found? One particularly difficult day, Sarah came home to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table, still in her diner uniform, looking exhausted. Maria Martinez was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with calloused hands and tired eyes. It was hard for Sarah to imagine this quiet, gentle person as the brave soldier she had envisioned. "Mom," Sarah said carefully, setting down her backpack, "can I ask you something about when you were in the army?" One health. Maria's body tensed immediately, and she looked up at her daughter with a mixture of pain and warning in her eyes. "Mija, we've talked about this before. That part of my life is over. I don't like to think about those times. But Mom, kids at school are saying I'm lying about you being a soldier. They're making fun of me every day. Can't you just tell me something? Anything that I can say to make them stop?" Maria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "Those kids don't know anything about anything," she said, her voice sharp with an edge Sarah rarely heard. "And they don't need to know. What I did over there, it's not for children to understand. But I'm not a child anymore, Mom. I'm 17. And I'm tired of being humiliated because I can't prove that my own mother is a hero." The word hero seemed to hit Maria like a physical blow. She sat back down heavily, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for the coffee cup that had grown cold while she waited for Sarah to come home. "I'm no hero, Mija," she said quietly. "Heroes don't come home. Heroes don't get to serve coffee and raise beautiful daughters. I just did my job and got lucky enough to make it back." That night, Sarah lay in bed thinking about her mother's words. There was something in her voice, something in the way she had said, "Heroes don't come home," that made Sarah realize her mother was carrying secrets much heavier than she had ever imagined. The bullying at school continued to escalate. What had started as cruel jokes had evolved into something more systematic and vicious. Someone had created a fake social media account called Captain Sarah's Mom that posted ridiculous military-themed memes. Students would tag Sarah in the posts, ensuring she saw every humiliating joke. The worst incident happened on a Friday afternoon during gym class. Sarah was walking toward the locker room when she found a group of students gathered around something posted on the bulletin board. As she got closer, she realized they had created a fake military commendation certificate for her mother, complete with made-up awards like Distinguished Service in Breakfast Combat and Purple Heart for Burns from the coffee pot. "Oh, look, Sarah," Ashley called out loudly. "We made something special for your mom. Maybe you can give it to her at the diner tonight." The certificate was crudely made, but detailed enough to be particularly cruel. It included official-looking military seals and language, making a mockery of real military honors. Sarah stared at it, feeling a rage building inside her that she had never experienced before. Without saying a word, she tore the certificate down and ripped it into pieces, throwing the fragments at Ashley's feet. The gesture was met with applause and laughter from the gathered students, as if her anger was just another part of their entertainment. "Wow, Sarah. Your mom really taught you how to fight," Marcus said, causing another wave of laughter. "Is that part of her special forces training too?" Sarah ran toward the school exit, ignoring the calls from teachers who had noticed the commotion. She didn't stop running until she reached the bus stop 3 blocks away, where she sat on the bench and finally allowed herself to cry freely. As she sat there, watching cars pass by and people going about their normal Friday afternoon routines, Sarah made a decision. She was going to find out the truth about her mother's service, no matter what it took. She was tired of being humiliated, tired of doubting herself, and tired of protecting secrets she didn't understand. That evening, while her mother was working the late shift at the diner, Sarah went into her mother's bedroom and began searching more thoroughly than she ever had before. She found the box she remembered from years ago, hidden behind old sweaters in the back of the closet. Inside, along with the photographs she had seen before, she found documents she had never noticed. There were deployment orders, commendation letters, and medical records that painted a picture of service far more complex and dangerous than Sarah had ever imagined. Her mother hadn't just served in Afghanistan. She had been part of specialized units, worked with intelligence operations, and been involved in missions that were still classified. As Sarah read through the documents by the light of her phone, she began to understand why her mother had been so reluctant to discuss her service. These weren't the experiences of someone who had worked in an office or cafeteria. These were the records of someone who had risked her life repeatedly in service of her country. But understanding the truth and proving it to her classmates were two very different things. The documents were technical, full of military abbreviations and references that Sarah didn't completely understand, and she knew that even if she brought them to school, her tormentors would just claim they were fake or stolen from the internet. As she carefully put everything back in its place, Sarah realized she needed help. She needed someone who could verify what she had found, someone who could speak the same language as these documents. But who could she trust with something this important and this personal? The answer came to her the next morning, as she was getting ready for what she expected to be another difficult day at school. Veterans Day was coming up the following week, and the school was planning an assembly to honor military service members from the community. Maybe, just maybe, this would be her chance to find someone who could help her understand and validate her mother's story. Sarah spent the weekend researching local veterans organizations and military support groups. She found contact information for several groups that met regularly in their area, and she began drafting emails explaining her situation. It felt strange, reaching out to complete strangers about something so personal, but she was running out of options. The responses she received were overwhelmingly supportive. Veterans from different conflicts and different branches of service all offered to help her understand her mother's records and connect her with others who might have served in similar capacities. One email stood out from the rest. It was from a man named James Rodriguez, who had served in Afghanistan during the same time period as Sarah's mother. He mentioned that he had worked with several female soldiers who were involved in intelligence and reconnaissance operations, and he offered to meet with Sarah to discuss what she had found. As Sarah prepared for school on Monday morning, she felt a mix of hope and nervousness. For the first time in weeks, she had a plan that might lead to some answers. She didn't know exactly where this path would lead, but she knew she couldn't continue living with the doubts and humiliation any longer. The day started like any other, with whispered jokes and pointed looks from her classmates. But Sarah carried herself differently, knowing that she was finally taking action instead of just enduring the abuse. She had no idea that by the end of the week, everything would change in ways she never could have imagined. Tuesday afternoon found Sarah sitting in a small coffee shop downtown, nervously checking her phone every few minutes. James Rodriguez had agreed to meet her after school, and she had spent the entire day wondering if this was a mistake. What if he thought she was just another attention-seeking teenager? What if her mother found out she was sharing private family information with strangers? At exactly 4 o'clock, a man in his early 50s walked through the door, scanning the coffee shop until his eyes met Sarah's. James Rodriguez was tall and lean, with graying hair and the kind of bearing that immediately suggested military background. He moved with purpose and precision. And when he smiled at Sarah, she felt some of her nervousness begin to fade. "You must be Sarah," he said, extending his hand as he approached her table. "Thank you for reaching out. It takes courage to ask for help, especially about something this personal." As they settled into their conversation, Sarah found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. James listened carefully as she described the situation at school, the documents she had found, and her mother's reluctance to discuss her service. He asked thoughtful questions and never once made her feel like her concerns were trivial or unimportant. "Can I see some of the documents you mentioned?" James asked gently. "I brought copies of some of my own service records, so you can see what legitimate military paperwork looks like." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him photographs she had taken of her mother's documents. James studied them carefully, his expression growing more serious as he examined each image. "Sarah," he said finally, "these are absolutely genuine. And if I'm reading them correctly, your mother was involved in some very specialized and dangerous work. She was part of a female engagement team, which was a relatively new program when I was over there." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, leaning forward with interest. James explained that female engagement teams were small units of female soldiers who could interact with Afghan women and children in ways that male soldiers couldn't due to cultural restrictions. These teams often gathered crucial intelligence, provided medical assistance, and helped with community relations in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. "The work your mother did was incredibly important," James continued. "These teams often operated in forward positions, sometimes with minimal backup. They had to be smart, brave, and resourceful. Not everyone could handle that kind of assignment." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt validated. Here was someone who understood the military language in her mother's documents, someone who could confirm that her pride in her mother's service was justified. "But why won't she talk about it?" Sarah asked. "If what she did was so important, why does she act like it never happened?" James was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup before responding. "War changes people, Sarah. Your mother probably saw things, experienced things, that are difficult to process. Some veterans find it easier to move forward by focusing on the present instead of reliving the past." He went on to explain that many veterans, particularly those who had been involved in combat operations, struggled with what civilians called post-traumatic stress disorder. For some people, talking about their service brought back memories they preferred to keep buried. "That doesn't mean she's ashamed of what she did," James assured her. "It just means she's found a way to cope that works for her. And honestly, the fact that she's managed to build a stable life for you shows incredible strength." As their conversation continued, James mentioned that he was still in touch with several people who had served in Afghanistan during the same period as Sarah's mother. He offered to make some discreet inquiries, to see if anyone remembered working with or hearing about Maria Martinez. "I want to be very clear about something," he said seriously. "We're not going to do anything that would make your mother uncomfortable or violate her privacy. This is about helping you understand your family's history, not about forcing her to relive experiences she'd rather leave in the past." Sarah agreed, feeling grateful that James understood the delicate nature of the situation. They exchanged contact information, and he promised to reach out within a few days if he learned anything useful. The rest of the week at school was more of the same cruel behavior from her classmates. But Sarah found it easier to endure, knowing that she was finally making progress toward understanding the truth. She threw herself into researching female engagement teams, learning about their role in Afghanistan, and the challenges they faced. What she discovered made her even more proud of her mother. These teams had been crucial in building relationships with local communities, often working in areas where traditional military operations had failed to make progress. They had to be diplomats, medics, intelligence gatherers, and warriors all at once. On Thursday evening, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from James. "Can you meet tomorrow after school? I have some information I think you'll want to hear." I have some texter. I have some information. Friday couldn't come fast enough. Sarah struggled to focus on her classes, constantly checking the clock and counting down the minutes until she could meet with James again. The usual taunts from her classmates barely registered as her mind raced with possibilities about what he might have discovered. When she arrived at the coffee shop, she immediately noticed that James wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was a woman in her 40s, with short, dark hair and intense green eyes. She was wearing civilian clothes, but like James, she carried herself with unmistakable military bearing. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Colonel Patricia Williams," James said as she approached their table. She was involved in coordinating female engagement team operations in Afghanistan. Colonel Williams stood and shook Sarah's hand with a firm grip. "James told me about your situation," she said. "I remember your mother." "I remember your mother." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "You knew my mom?" "I knew Sergeant Maria Martinez," Colonel Williams corrected gently. "And I can tell you that she was one of the most capable soldiers I ever had the privilege of working with." Over the next hour, Colonel Williams painted a picture of Sarah's mother that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She described Maria as fearless in dangerous situations, compassionate with Afghan civilians, and fiercely protective of her fellow soldiers. She had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments and had saved lives on multiple occasions. "There was one mission in particular," Colonel Williams said, her voice growing serious. "We had received intelligence about a group of women and children being held by insurgents in a compound outside Kandahar. Traditional forces couldn't approach without putting the hostages at risk. But a female engagement team might be able to get close enough to assess the situation." Sarah listened with growing amazement as the colonel described how her mother had volunteered to lead a small team into extremely dangerous territory. They had posed as aid workers, using their cultural training to gain access to areas where male soldiers would have been immediately identified as threats. "Your mother spent 3 days in that village, gathering intelligence and building relationships with local women who could provide information about the hostages," Colonel Williams continued. "When the rescue operation finally went forward, it was successful because of the groundwork she had laid." "What happened to the hostages?" Sarah asked, completely absorbed in the story. 12 women and children were rescued safely," Colonel Williams said. "Your mother's work, quite literally, saved their lives." But the story didn't end there. Colonel Williams explained that during the extraction, Maria's team had come under heavy fire. She had stayed behind to provide cover for the other members of her unit, ensuring they could reach safety before attempting to escape herself. "She was wounded in that operation," Colonel Williams said quietly. "Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that she spent several weeks in a military hospital in Germany before being cleared to return to duty." Sarah thought about the medical records she had seen in her mother's documents, suddenly understanding references she hadn't been able to decipher before. Her mother hadn't just served with distinction. She had been wounded in combat while saving the lives of others. "The thing you need to understand," Colonel Williams continued, "is that your mother could have been awarded a Bronze Star for her actions that day. The paperwork was submitted, and she certainly deserved the recognition. But she specifically requested that the commendation process be stopped." "Why would she do that?" Sarah asked, confused. James and Colonel Williams exchanged a meaningful look before the colonel answered. "Some soldiers don't want the attention that comes with high-profile awards. They just want to do their job and move on with their lives. Your mother was always more concerned with the mission than with personal recognition." As the meeting concluded, Colonel Williams reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "I brought copies of some official documents related to your mother's service," she said, handing the folder to Sarah. "These are her actual service records, performance evaluations, and mission reports. If anyone questions your mother's military background, these will provide all the proof you need. Sarah opened the folder and found herself looking at page after page of official military documentation. Performance reviews consistently rated her mother as exceptional and exceeds standards in all areas. Mission reports described her as invaluable to unit success and demonstrates exceptional courage under fire. But more than the documentation itself, Sarah was struck by the care that Colonel Williams had taken in assembling this information. Someone who had served with her mother had taken time out of their busy life to help a teenager they had never met, simply because they remembered Maria Martinez as someone worthy of respect and recognition. "Colonel," Sarah said, looking up from the documents, "thank you for this. But I have to ask something else. My classmates have been pretty cruel about this whole thing. Some of them are going to claim that even these documents are fake. Is there any way to prove that these stories are real?" Colonel Williams smiled for the first time during their conversation. "As a matter of fact, there is. James told me about the Veterans Day Assembly at your school next week. I've been invited to speak at several local schools during Veterans Day week, and I'd be happy to add your school to my schedule." "You would come to my school?" Sarah asked, hardly believing what she was hearing. "More than that," Colonel Williams said. "I'll bring some other veterans who served in Afghanistan during the same time period as your mother. We'll talk about the important work that female engagement teams did, and we'll make sure your classmates understand exactly what kinds of sacrifices military families have made." James nodded in agreement. "And I'll be there too. Between the three of us, we should be able to provide a pretty comprehensive picture of what military service in Afghanistan was really like." As Sarah walked home that evening, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was proud, validated, and excited about the upcoming Veterans Day Assembly. But she was also somewhat apprehensive about her mother's reaction when she found out what Sarah had been doing. That night at dinner, Sarah decided to test the waters by mentioning the upcoming Veterans Day Assembly at school. Her mother's reaction was immediate and negative. "I don't want you getting involved in any of that military stuff at school," Maria said firmly. "It's not appropriate, and it's not necessary." "But Mom, they're just honoring veterans." "What's wrong with learning about military service?" Maria set down her fork and looked directly at her daughter. "Mija, I've told you before that I don't want to talk about those times. And I don't want you talking about them either. What's past is past." Sarah felt her frustration rising again, but she tried to keep her voice calm. "Mom, what if I told you that some people at school don't believe you ever served in the military? What if I told you they've been making fun of me for weeks because they think I'm lying about having a veteran for a mother?" For a moment, Maria's composure cracked, and Sarah saw a flash of the steel that had made her mother such an effective soldier. "What people?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp. "Just some kids at school," Sarah said quickly, realizing she might have revealed more than she intended. But Maria was no longer listening. She stood up from the table and began pacing around the small kitchen, her hands clenched into fists. "Those little punks don't know anything about anything," she muttered. "They have no idea what real service looks like, what real sacrifice means." "Mom, it's okay," Sarah said, trying to calm her down. "No, it's not okay," Maria said, turning to face her daughter. "And you shouldn't have to handle it. Nobody should question your family's honor, especially not some spoiled kids who've never faced any real challenges in their lives." For the first time since the whole ordeal began, Sarah saw her mother as the warrior she had once been. The quiet, tired woman who worked double shifts at the diner was still there. But underneath was someone who had faced down enemy fire and emerged victorious. "Maybe," Sarah said carefully, "it would help if people knew the truth about what you did over there. Maybe if they understood what female engagement teams actually accomplished, they would show more respect." Maria stopped pacing and stared at her daughter. "How do you know about female engagement teams?" Sarah realized she had made a mistake. In her excitement about learning the truth, she had revealed that her research had gone far beyond the documents she had found in her mother's closet. But it was too late to take back the words now. "I've been doing some reading," she said lamely. Maria sat back down at the table, her expression unreadable. Sarah, exactly what kind of reading have you been doing? And who have you been talking to? 2. The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. She could continue trying to hide her investigation, or she could tell her mother the truth about everything that had been happening and everything she had learned. Looking at her mother's face, seeing the mixture of concern and suspicion there, Sarah made her choice. She was going to tell the truth, whatever the consequences might be. Sarah took a deep breath and began telling her mother everything. She described the weeks of humiliation at school, the cruel jokes and fake certificates, and her growing desperation to prove that her mother's service was real and honorable. She explained how she had reached out to local veterans organizations and met with James Rodriguez and Colonel Williams. As Sarah spoke, she watched her mother's expression change from suspicion to concern to something that looked almost like pride. When she mentioned Colonel Williams by name, Maria's eyes widened with recognition. "Patricia Williams?" Maria said quietly. "Colonel Patricia Williams? You do remember her," Sarah said, relieved that her mother wasn't angry about her unauthorized investigation. "I remember her," Maria said, her voice growing soft. "She was a good officer. Fair, smart, and she cared about her soldiers. I haven't thought about her in years." Sarah pulled out the folder of documents that Colonel Williams had given her and placed it on the table between them. "She gave me these. She said you were one of the most capable soldiers she ever worked with." Maria opened the folder slowly, as if she were handling something fragile and dangerous. As she read through the documents, Sarah could see emotions playing across her face that she had never witnessed before. Her mother was remembering things she had spent years trying to forget. "She kept all of this?" Maria asked, holding up a performance evaluation dated from her second tour in Afghanistan. "She said you deserved recognition for what you did. She told me about the rescue mission, about how you saved those women and children." Maria closed the folder and looked directly at her daughter. "What exactly did she tell you?" Sarah recounted the story as Colonel Williams had told it, watching her mother's face carefully for any sign of how she should react. When she finished, Maria was quiet for a long moment. "She left out some parts," Maria said finally. "The parts that still wake me up at night sometimes." "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Sarah said quickly. "I just wanted people to know that you were brave, that you did important things." Maria stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the small backyard where she had taught Sarah to ride a bicycle years ago. "You want to know why I don't talk about Afghanistan?" she asked without turning around. Sarah nodded, even though her mother couldn't see her. "Because every day over there, I had to make decisions that no person should have to make," Maria continued. "I had to choose who to trust and who might be trying to kill me. I had to comfort dying soldiers who were barely older than you are now. I had to leave that village, knowing that some of the women I had worked with might be punished for helping us." She turned back to face Sarah, and for the first time, Sarah could see the weight her mother had been carrying for all these years. "I did my job, and I did it well," Maria said. "But being good at war isn't something you celebrate. It's something you survive and try to move past." "But Mom, what you did mattered. You saved lives." "Yes, I did," Maria agreed. "And I also took lives. I saw things that no mother should see, did things that no mother should do. When I came home, all I wanted was to be normal, to be the kind of mother who worries about homework and curfews instead of bombs and bullets." Sarah was beginning to understand why her mother had been so reluctant to discuss her military service. It wasn't shame or modesty. It was a desire to protect her daughter from the harsh realities of what military service sometimes required. "The kids at school," Sarah said carefully, "they're going to keep making fun of me unless someone shows them they're wrong. And you think having Colonel Williams come to your school will solve that? I think it might help." She said she would talk about female engagement teams, explain what they really did. Maybe if my classmates understood what military service actually means, they would be more respectful. Maria considered this for several minutes, staring down at the folder of documents. Finally, she made a decision that surprised both of them. "Okay," she said, "but I have one condition." "What do you mean?" "I mean that if Patricia Williams is going to stand up in front of your school and talk about what we did in Afghanistan, then I should be there to answer any questions honestly. These kids want to know if I'm a real veteran? Fine. Let them ask me themselves." Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Mom, are you sure? You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Maria said firmly. "Not for them, and not even for you. I need to do this for me. I've been hiding from my service for too long, pretending it didn't happen. Maybe it's time to stop running from who I used to be." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Sarah contacted Colonel Williams to let her know about her mother's decision to participate in the Veterans Day Assembly. The colonel was delighted and immediately began coordinating with the school administration to expand the program. Meanwhile, word had somehow gotten out that something special was planned for the Veterans Day Assembly. Students who had been tormenting Sarah suddenly seemed curious about what might happen, though their questions still carried undertones of skepticism. "I heard some military people are coming to our school," Ashley said to Sarah in the hallway on Monday morning. "Are they friends of yours or something?" "Something like that," Sarah replied, trying to keep her expression neutral. Sarah Wendav, to my. "Well, I hope they're real military and not just people in costume," Marcus added with his usual sneer. "It would be pretty embarrassing if we found out this whole thing was fake." Sarah smiled mysteriously. "I guess you'll find out on Friday." As the week progressed, Sarah found herself growing more nervous rather than less. She had gotten what she wanted: validation of her mother's service and an opportunity to prove her classmates wrong. But she was also worried about how her mother would handle being in the spotlight again. Thursday evening, Sarah found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with her old military uniforms laid out in front of her. They had been carefully preserved, and the ribbons and badges were exactly as they had been when Maria returned from her final deployment. "I haven't looked at these in 5 years," Maria said without looking up. "I wasn't sure they would still fit." "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Sarah asked, sitting down across from her mother. "Terrified," Maria admitted. "But also, I don't know. Maybe it's time to stop being ashamed of who I was over there." "You were never ashamed," Sarah said. "You were protecting yourself, and you were protecting me." Maria looked up at her daughter with a sad smile. "You're very wise for 17. I hope tomorrow doesn't change how you see me." Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with a light rain that seemed to match Sarah's mood. She had barely slept the night before, running through dozens of scenarios about how the assembly might go. Would her classmates finally show respect for her mother's service? Would they find new ways to be cruel? Would her mother be able to handle the stress of speaking publicly about experiences she had kept private for so long? The assembly was scheduled for the last period of the day, and Sarah found it almost impossible to concentrate on her morning classes. Her teachers seemed to understand that her mind was elsewhere and didn't push her to participate in discussions or answer questions. At lunch, she sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at her food and watching the clock. The same students who had been tormenting her for weeks were gathered at their usual table, but their conversation seemed more subdued than normal. Sarah wondered if they were feeling any nervousness about the afternoon's events. Finally, the last period arrived, and students began filing into the school auditorium. Sarah had saved seats in the front row for her mother and the visiting veterans. But as students filled the seats behind her, she could hear whispers and speculation about what was going to happen. "I heard Sarah's mom is actually going to be here," someone said behind her. "This should be interesting," came the reply. At exactly 2:30, the side door of the auditorium opened, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her mother entered wearing her dress uniform, every ribbon and badge perfectly positioned. She walked with military bearing, her shoulders straight and her head held high. Behind her came Colonel Williams, James Rodriguez, and 2 other veterans Sarah didn't recognize. The effect on the assembled students was immediate and dramatic. The whispers died away completely, replaced by a respectful silence as the veterans took their seats. Sarah felt a surge of pride as she looked at her mother, seeing her for the first time as others would see her. Not as a tired diner waitress, but as a decorated soldier who had served her country with distinction. Principal Johnson stepped to the podium to introduce the speakers, but before he could begin, Colonel Williams stood and approached the microphone. "Before we start," she said, her voice carrying easily throughout the auditorium, "I want to address something that's been brought to my attention. It seems that some students at this school have been questioning whether one of your classmates has been truthful about her mother's military service." Sarah felt every eye in the auditorium turn toward her, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't embarrassed. Instead, she felt anticipation building as Colonel Williams continued. "I'm here today not just to honor veterans in general, but to honor one veteran in particular. Sergeant Maria Martinez served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan as part of a female engagement team. She volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, saved the lives of fellow soldiers and Afghan civilians, and was wounded in combat while providing cover for her unit during a rescue operation." The auditorium remained completely silent, but Sarah could feel the energy in the room shifting. Students who had been slouching in their seats were sitting up straighter, paying attention in a way that was completely different from their usual assembly behavior. "I know Sergeant Martinez personally," Colonel Williams continued. "I was her commanding officer during her 2nd and 3rd deployments. I can tell you without reservation that she is one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege of serving with. Any questions about her service record or her integrity are not just wrong. They're insulting to every veteran who has ever worn the uniform." With that, Colonel Williams stepped back from the podium and gestured for Maria to approach. Sarah watched her mother stand up and walk to the microphone with the same confident bearing she had displayed when she entered the auditorium. "My name is Maria Martinez," she said, her voice steady and clear. "For the past 5 years, I've been serving coffee and taking orders at Tony's Diner downtown. Some of you may have seen me there, but before I was a waitress, I was a soldier." What followed was the most compelling presentation Sarah had ever witnessed. Her mother spoke about her decision to join the army, her training, and her deployment to Afghanistan. She described the work of female engagement teams in terms that made their importance clear without going into graphic detail about the dangers they faced. "We were often the only Americans who could communicate directly with Afghan women," Maria explained. "In that culture, women and men exist in separate worlds. If we wanted to understand what was happening in local communities, if we wanted to help protect families and children, we needed female soldiers who could cross those cultural boundaries." She talked about the friendships she had formed with Afghan women, the children she had helped treat for injuries and illnesses, and the intelligence information that had helped protect both Afghan civilians and American soldiers. As she spoke, Sarah realized that her mother was not just defending her military service. She was finally allowing herself to acknowledge the good that had come from her time in Afghanistan. "Military service changes you," Maria continued, her voice growing more personal. "You see the worst that humans can do to each other, but you also see the best. You see soldiers risking their lives to protect people they've never met. You see Afghan mothers doing everything they can to keep their children safe. You see what real courage looks like. And it's not always what you expect." She paused for a moment, looking out at the assembled students. "When I came home, I didn't want to talk about any of this. I wanted to forget the bad parts and move on with my life. But I realize now that forgetting the bad parts also means forgetting the good parts. It means forgetting the lives we saved, the connections we made, and the pride that comes from serving something bigger than yourself." Maria's eyes found Sarah in the front row, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only 2 people in the auditorium. "My daughter has been proud of my service even when I wasn't willing to be proud of it myself. She defended my honor when I was too tired and too scared to defend it myself. That takes a different kind of courage, but it's just as real." As Maria concluded her remarks and returned to her seat, the auditorium erupted in applause. But this wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that usually accompanied school assemblies. This was genuine, sustained applause that seemed to go on forever. James Rodriguez and the other veterans spoke briefly about their own experiences, but the heart of the assembly had been Maria's presentation. When Colonel Williams returned to the podium for closing remarks, the atmosphere in the auditorium had completely transformed. "I want to leave you with one final thought," Colonel Williams said. "Military families often carry burdens that others don't see or understand. When someone tells you that a parent or sibling or friend has served in the military, your response should be gratitude and respect, not skepticism. These families have already sacrificed more than most people ever will." As students began filing out of the auditorium, Sarah noticed that many of them stopped to speak with her mother and the other veterans. The conversations were respectful, curious, and genuine. Students asked questions about military training, about life in Afghanistan, and about the transition back to civilian life. Ashley Thompson, who had been one of the ringleaders in mocking Sarah's claims about her mother, approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Martinez," she said quietly, "I owe you and Sarah an apology. I said some really awful things, and I was completely wrong." Maria looked at the girl for a moment before responding. "We all make mistakes," she said finally. "What matters is what we do after we realize we've made them." Marcus Williams also approached, looking genuinely ashamed of his previous behavior. "I had no idea," he said simply. "I'm sorry." As the auditorium emptied, Sarah found herself standing with her mother and the veterans who had made the day possible. She felt overwhelmed with gratitude and relief, but also with a new understanding of her mother's complexity and strength. "How do you feel?" James Rodriguez asked Maria. "Different," she replied honestly. "Like I've been holding my breath for 5 years and finally remembered how to exhale." Colonel Williams placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. "You did good work over there, Sergeant. And you did good work here today, too." As they walked toward the parking lot together, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed between her and her mother. The secrets were gone, the shame had been lifted, and for the first time, they could both be proud of their family's military legacy. "Mom," Sarah said as they reached their car, "thank you for doing this. I know it wasn't easy. Thank you for making me do it," Maria replied. "I forgot that I used to be brave. It felt good to remember." The following Monday at school, Sarah's experience was completely different from anything she had endured in the previous weeks. Students who had never spoken to her before stopped to ask about her mother and to share stories about their own family members who had served in the military. Teachers treated her with new respect, and the cruel jokes had disappeared entirely. More importantly, the relationship between Sarah and her mother had evolved in ways that neither of them had anticipated. Maria began sharing stories about her military service, helping Sarah understand not just what she had done, but why it had mattered. They looked through photo albums together, with Maria explaining the faces and places that had been mysterious to Sarah for so long. "I think I was afraid that if I talked about being a soldier, I might forget how to be a mother," Maria admitted one evening, as they sat together, looking through old photographs. "But I realize now that being a good soldier and being a good mother aren't so different. They both require courage, sacrifice, and protecting the people you care about." Sarah's experience had taught her valuable lessons about the importance of family honor, the complexity of military service, and the courage required to stand up for what's right. But perhaps most importantly, it had shown her that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like. Sometimes they're small women who work double shifts at diners and keep their greatest accomplishments hidden away in shoeboxes, waiting for the right moment to remind the world of what real service means. The Veterans Day Assembly had lasted only an hour, but its impact would be felt for years to come. Students at Sarah's school would think twice before questioning someone's family military history. Teachers would be more aware of the hidden sacrifices that military families make, and Sarah and her mother would continue building a relationship based on honesty, respect, and shared pride in a legacy of service that neither of them would ever again feel the need to hide.